Welcome back to the Now Morning Show. So we're focusing this morning conversation on the short and long-term effects of bullying, something that has definitely been in the headlines, but none of us are a stranger to. Joining us this morning in studio is Sule A. Joseph, Counselling Psychologist in Child and Family Specialization, and Nicole Young, Guidance Counselor. Good morning, Nicole. Good morning, Sule, and welcome.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on the show and a pleasure to have you as well. Both no strangers to the Now Morning Show.
Yes,
That is
I'm
for
coming
sure.
home.
Listen, you're home. Exactly. And this is such an important conversation because at the end of the day, of course, given the most recent incidents that have been experienced throughout the world, we've seen many people focusing on it. But we're not a stranger to this. This is something that has, for some may say, from time immemorial, but we've seen the change in how we recognize bullying.
The evolution,
Yeah, the evolution of it. Let's speak about that, Sule. Let's speak about the evolution of bullying. What have you seen, let's say, over the past few decades?
Well, first we need to kind of clarify because we do have a culture in Trinidad of peacock.
Yeah.
Right? And so people often confuse peacock and bullying and think of it as one and the same, and it isn't. Right? When we talk about bullying is a deliberate punching down repeatedly for the sake of it's an advantageous thing.
Right.
Right? So when we're talking about bullying, it's somebody who does it repeatedly with some level of aggression for a purpose, but it's punching down.
Right.
Right? And it's deliberate. When we talk about peacock, at least the idea of peacock is that all parties are involved and participating in it, right? So that you throw talk for someone and then the person sends talk back for you. So when we talk about peacock being bullying, it technically isn't. It doesn't have all of the features required for it to be considered bullying necessarily. Right. The difference is the power imbalance.
Right. No, that's interesting because recently in conversation, speaking to some Gen Zs and some Gen As, their perspectives are a little bit different. It seems as though they don't necessarily have that understanding or that respect for peacock that we would have had growing up. Is it something that is still an active part of our culture with that generation?
Well, the younger generation, the tolerance levels for things like that have declined significantly. So I guess it's weird that I don't like the whole wokeness culture. And so anything that you feel does not speak to you in a positive light, generally, persons can say, listen, I feel as though this is attacking me and this is bullying and I don't like it. Yeah. Right? Which by itself is positive because it gives you a space to say and identify that you don't like something. But then what is the balance? The balance we have to look at is, are we also creating a generation of persons who can't cope or who are losing the ability to cope with certain things and who internalize everything and then have a breakdown because they can't treat with words thrown and that sort of thing.
Definitely. It goes back to that old adage of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, which is still basically a topic for debate, of course, for many of us as well. Nicole, in your experience as a guidance counselor, have you seen an increase as time has gone on of those coming to you dealing with the effects of bullying?
As they said, I think this generation, they are very aware of their rights or their perceived rights. I use that word very loosely. So they are very sensitive. So yes, I recognize a lot of students would come to me to talk about any ill that they may feel. Not necessarily bullying, because once again, as Sule said, bullying is repetitive, intentional hurting. So if somebody does something accidentally to offend you, that's not bullying.
Right.
If they do something once, it's not classified as bullying. But definitely the students, they feel very empowered. I realize that more and more that they feel empowered to speak out. And I think at my school and schools in general, I think the guidance counselors and also the staff, they tend to create a space where students feel safe.
In a safe space. That's beautiful.
To speak out.
Yeah, and that's so important.
So I think a lot more recently we see even young men before. Young boys may not have spoken as much about any ills, but now they feel a little bit more empowered. I mean, we still have a lot more work to do, but I do feel that the alphas, they are a little more vocal.
Definitely more vocal. And we need to get into the short and long-term effects, but something that has struck me this morning, so I know those who are watching are also going to be struck, is the specific definition of bullying. This is not a one-time thing. It's a power imbalance and so much more. So can you both expound on that?
Cool.
I mean, so Exactly that. It's not a one-time thing.
Right.
So of course somebody can offend you once, but will be classified as bullying? No. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't speak out about it, but I think that it's so important that we understand the difference, because this word is just being thrown around and then it becomes kind of weakened. But bullying is a very serious thing. So definitely we have to understand it's a repetitive thing as well as intentional, because sometimes people do things and they don't recognize that it's hurting you.
Yeah.
As also it's characterized by this power imbalance. One person is perceived to have more power than the other person who's the victim.
Right, definitely. Now let's get into the short and long-term effects of it, Sule.
So essentially, bullying could be considered psychological abuse.
Right.
So it's a form of abuse. And like any other form of abuse, it can have significant psychological and physiological ramifications.
Yeah.
That's a lot of big words just to say it could hurt you plenty.
Plenty.
Right? It means it can affect diet, it can affect weight, it can affect your self-esteem. Of course, that's a big part of it. Self-concept.
Sleep patterns.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It can affect how you sleep. Because essentially, when you talk about dealing with bullying, the person who's being bullied can suffer with anxiety about thinking about having to face this bully yet again. Because as Nicole pointed out, it's a repetitive action.
Right.
It's not a one-time occurrence, yeah? So somebody saying something that you don't like in Parliament, for example, is not bullying. That might just be a one-time occurrence, right? That, something else was been said that you take personal offense to and so on. But definitely, it can affect, if it affects anxiety, it can affect self-esteem.
Yeah.
Because you're up at night
100%.
thinking, what is my self-worth? These people have been saying X, Y, Z. Am I really somebody who, that sort of thing, and And that can affect self-worth. And of course, if your self-worth is affected, then you can start thinking about self-harm is a very real possibility.
Right.
Self-injurious behaviors, as the Gen A is calling it now, unaliving yourself is a possible, side effect and so on.
And it's something that unfortunately we have seen now. We speak about that happening, but what about the, let's say, long-term effects of childhood bullying, if it translates into adulthood as well? Is that something that we see manifesting?
Remember, we categorize bullying like a form of abuse.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've found with abuse victims is that abuse victims oftentimes become abusers later.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a form of empowering. So they try to empower themselves from being abused and oftentimes start to develop characteristics of the abuser who abused them, kind of thing, and continue this cycle of abuse. So that is something definitely to look out for. For example, you may have a parent who said, listen, my parents used to beat me and I turned out just fine. So I'm going to beat you so you turn out just fine, right? So that's the cycle, right? And while you are in it, you're thinking, listen, I'm never going to beat my child because this is terrible. I don't enjoy this. But somehow along the line, you start to develop those same characteristics and then repeat the behaviors. So that's a real possibility.
Can I just say
Of
one
course.
thing? It's interesting. Recently, of course, this discussion has been on the forefront of our nation. A lot of persons have been speaking about it. I think when reading the comments, something that persons are not actually recognizing or they're conveniently forgetting, these bullies didn't just appear. A lot of times, these young people are home in situations where there's domestic violence, and we could classify it as domestic violence, but it is essentially bullying.
Yes.
There is one parent, for example, maybe, who is honestly, there's a power imbalance where that person is either verbally or physically abusing, bullying the other person, and we don't recognize it. So children are seeing these things happening. They sometimes, as Sule said, are the victims as well of the bullying. So it's going to be perpetrated in a school setting, for example. And one other thing, though, is that when we think bullying, we think children in a school. Bullying happens in workplaces.
Yes.
Yeah, correct.
So there are a lot of adults who are actually
Adult bullies.
So it's just something to think about, and maybe workplaces need to do more to recognize it and try to curb it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you there more as well. It seems as though, of course, this is something that spans regardless of whether it's in person or even in a virtual setting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
We see what happens online as well, and we tend to forget ourselves.
Actually,
Go ahead.
with the Gen Zs and the Gen As now, the virtual space is the prime real estate for bullying. So you hear people talking about not that it happened in school, but it happened online.
Yeah.
Right? And So the fact that it happens online now, it makes it worse apparently, because now, you know, the whole world has access to me being bullied and being called a particular name and so on and whatever. And what at least I've found in practice is that whereas previous generations took it personally when you insulted family members, for example, if you spoke about somebody's mother, they would get upset. Gen Zs now and Gen A's don't care. It's about insulting them personally. So if you insult me personally, that's an issue. Talk about my mother and whoever else if you want, but not me. You know? They have been.
It's incredible to see the change, and I think this is definitely a conversation we could continue for sure, because I tell you, as the generations change, so many things change with it. But we are out of time. Sule, thank you for joining us. Nicole, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you for having us.
It's been a pleasure. We're speaking about, of course, the long-term and short-term effects of bullying, and quite a lot more this morning on the Now Morning Show. And stay tuned, because coming up after the break, it's time for Unique, Not Different with Shamla.